They're not perfect, they're automated, but they're there. So if you want to turn that on, you can. At the bottom of your screen, there's a CC sign that you can press. So I'm Michelle Aaron, the director of Screening Rights Film Festival. As I said, we're in our 6th year. We specialize in social justice issues and how they get animated and work for all kinds of reasons through film. And I'm delighted to be screening Born in EVIN this evening. I won't talk for too long. I just need to thank our sponsors, principally the Humanities Research Fund at the University of Warwick, the BFI Film Hub Midlands, and also thank the Coventry City of Culture 2021 for their support, and also Anya Ostrowska for her great job doing the Digital Festival Coordinator. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Michelle Devereaux, who's going to be chairing the panel this evening. She's a Leverhulme Trust Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the University of Warwick's Department of Film and Television Studies, where I'm also based. And she's currently working on a project that considers gender, trauma, and philosophical skepticism in contemporary film and television, which is what made her such a good option for a chair this evening, because gender and trauma are certainly a theme that recur through this film. She's worked at the University of Edinburgh and Birmingham and has published her first monograph that was on romanticism and contemporary American independent film. And I'm going to hand over to her now. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed Born in EVIN as much as I did. It's a very beautiful, moving, intimate documentary, and I'm very excited to talk about it today. As Michelle mentioned, I am doing research right now on gender and trauma. So I'm not, definitely not an expert in Iranian cinema or the films of the Iranian diaspora, but I'm very pleased today to have two such experts with us. And I thank both Dr. Maryam Ghorbankarimi from Lancaster University and Dr. Alena Strohmaier from Philipps-Universität in Marburg, Germany, for joining us for a discussion today. I have a couple of other housekeeping notes to talk to you about before we launch into the actual panel. First, if you could all keep your microphones muted before the Q&A session, just so we avoid a lot of background noise while panelists are speaking. So the format of the panel will be, I will give brief introductions of both Maryam and Alena. They will speak in turn for a few minutes. I will offer up some follow-up comments, and then we will open it up to a sort of roundtable discussion between the three of us. And at a certain point, probably about 25 minutes or a half hour in, we will open it up to questions from the audience. Feel free to put in your questions in the chat function in Zoom. If you would like to ask the question directly yourself, please let us know that. Otherwise, I will be reading the questions out myself. And we don't want to get too overwhelmed with the chat function. So if you could leave it till about 20 minutes or a half an hour in, I might actually make a little announcement of when would be a good time to ask your questions in chat. And so without further ado, we'll get started. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Maryam Ghorbankarimi, who is a filmmaker and lecturer in film practice at Lancaster University. Born and raised in Tehran, she relocated to Canada in 2001, where she studied film at Toronto's Ryerson University. In 2012, she completed her PhD in film studies at the University of Edinburgh. And her 2015 book, A Colorful Presence, The Evolution of Women's Representation in Iranian Cinema, is based on her doctoral thesis. She's a Higher Education Academy Fellow and the course leader of the MA Film Studies program at Lancaster. And welcome, Maryam.
Hello, thank you very much for the introduction, Michelle. First of all, I just really wanted to thank Michelle Aaron also for inviting me to join this panel. And it's wonderful to see that the Screen Rights Festival had managed to continue and with its 6th edition online. I thought that I'll keep my comments quite brief, that maybe then once we get a chance to, the three of us, to have a conversation and then open it up to the questions. Before, when I had read about the film, it was a film that kind of gave me a heartache. I think anybody who have lived and knows about Iran, the question of the EVIN and the scary element of the EVIN present, it's a very daunting element in our society. And those of you who would know where it's located in Tehran, it's actually in a very nice kind of uptown part of Tehran. But at the same time, it's a very kind of scary place. And I think you hardly find an Iranian who've lived in the past 40 years that might have had families or relations that one way or another have seen the inside of that kind of notorious prison. So I had this kind of whole idea of when you sit down and watch the film. So I thought it would be quite a difficult film to watch. And but I found it quite beautifully told, because it wasn't just a documentary to kind of come and tell us the history. As someone who works on Iran and kind of contemporary arts and culture, it is something that I'm quite well aware of the history of it. What the film does, which I think it does really beautifully, is that it's bringing this, as you call it, an intimate story. It's a very subjective, personal story. And the way that story is told through her perspective, and the fact that it's very obvious that she's, the first generation migrant growing up in Germany, and she's quite self-conscious about it. And one element that I found in the film quite done well is the fact that she's not trying to represent something she's not aware of, and takes us through this journey with her, learning more about it. Another element that I find the film to be quite well done, and is that the story she is telling us, it's easily transferable to other parts of the world, with people who have gone through similar traumatic events, with other notorious kind of prisons across the world in different kind of authoritarian societies. So it's easy to kind of understand it. So for me, while I got into the film, watching it, thinking this is going to be just about EVIN, in fact, it's not. It's about someone who somehow has unanswered questions of trauma in her past, and she wants to answer it. And this opens up the question and the relevance of the film to, for example, the refugee crisis that the world is going through quite a lot. And to me, I wish the way that she started the film with that question, that she's an actress, that she's kind of been circled to act certain roles. I wish at the end of the film she would return back to that, because to me, halfway through, it was about a second generation migrant / refugee in Europe growing up. And that's something that I think is quite relevant, even a lot more than what has happened actually at her birth. And I think these are the points that I found it quite interesting in the film. And I think I'm going to leave because I think I've already spoke a bit too long. But if there's any in the discussions it comes up more specific questions or something that I can, I don't know, shed light based on the fact that my research is quite relevant to position of women in Iran in general, I could help with that, and we'll have a discussion on this. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Maryam. Yeah, I had a similar response to the film that you did. And that's probably a lot to do with the fact that I'm studying trauma. So I was naturally cued into that aspect of it. But we'll talk about that more later. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Alena Strohmaier, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department for Media Studies and the Center for Near and Middle Eastern Studies at Philipps-Universität of Marburg in Germany. She's a project leader of an interdisciplinary research project entitled, "But I'm Not Filming, I'm Just Doing a Bit of Video, Cinematic Appropriation Processes of Protest Videos from the Middle East and North Africa since 2009, which was funded by the German Federal Ministry for Education and Research. She completed her PhD on films of the Iranian diaspora, which was published last year. She also co-edited the recent volume, Reconfigurations, Contextualizing Transformation Processes and Lasting Crises in the Middle East and North Africa. So please welcome Dr. Alena Strohmaier.
Thank you very much, Michelle and Michelle, for inviting me, and also for all the efforts put into having this digital film festival. I was saying just before that it's even though we all kind of experience this kind of digital fatigue, it's still great to have these kind of really important festivals and forums to discuss films, because yeah, we need to discuss them, and this is one example of how important I think it is, or how many questions we might have, because that would actually be my first stance on the film, is that the question Maryam Zere is having is actually creating less answers than even more questions, right? I mean, for her family, but also for us as an audience, there is actually, and until the end, no answer to her initial question or any other of the questions she had. And this is very interesting in the way the film is made. So it is a documentary, but it is what I would say, what Bill Nichols would call a performative documentary, right? It's not about, having this kind of talking heads explaining something, but we follow her in her quest. We see her sometimes also just sitting there and doing nothing, actually being a little bit lost, or having these conversations with different people. So she's actually yeah, and that's what I would say from a film studies perspective, seeing that as a performative documentary, which is interesting in that sense, as this quest for identity, she's doing it on a very in a very interesting way, I think, because as you may know, or may not, I don't know, she's pretty popular in Germany as an actress. And interestingly, she's actually nowadays not playing these kind of ethnic roles of Middle Eastern woman, Iranian woman. She actually played in a lot of German art house movies where her, let's say, ethnicity is not kind of mentioned, or not a topic. So making this movie about her identity on a stage where she's actually already pretty popular is in a way very interesting. I mean, or was very interesting for me, because it shows another side of her, right? Also as a, let's say, more maybe not only popular, but also like public figure in a way. And the interesting thing as well is that Maryam said, yeah, the title, right? Born in EVIN, and EVIN for her, it rings a lot of bells. But the interesting thing is, for a lot of people, it doesn't, because EVIN is a word, and I think for not all people who know that it's a prison, or the prison in Tehran, it might also just occur as born in whatever place. And I think that it actually plays a little bit on this title being both shocking, and for some people who understand what it means, and for those who don't. So I think there is also an ambivalence in this title. And this ambivalence, I think, it also shows in what Maryam already mentioned about this identity quest that is actually bound to her being in a diaspora, right? And my understanding of diaspora would actually be something that is not so much defined by ethnocentric or cultural essentialism. For me, diaspora is actually a notion of that is more fluid, let's say, that has maybe nothing to do only with this kind of, where am I coming from? And there as well, I see that there is an ambivalence in, she's asking where I'm coming from. I was born in EVIN. What is all this story about? But at the same time, she's actually not asking, okay, what is the Iranian side of my identity? What is the German side of my identity? Like these kind of, cultural essentialisms that one could ask in terms of, this more classical definitions of diaspora. And she's actually really a lot into this, yeah, performing not only as a documentary but also just as a person, as a woman, and not so much as an Iranian woman or a German woman. And this is actually what I really liked about the movie, and which for me makes it actually, if one wants to go even further, a movie that is not actually about diaspora but about post-diaspora, about a stage that we actually already might have surpassed, in terms of talking about cultural attributes, and this might open up a bigger discussion. I hope so. I would also leave it at that. So yeah, thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Alena. You raised a lot of interesting things that it didn't actually occur to me about diaspora, and that's piqued my curiosity. For me, myself, as I was saying, studying trauma and gender as I naturally kind of honed in on those aspects of the film. And I will have to confess that when before I watched the film, I had the idea that, not knowing anything about Maryam Ghorbankarimi, that it might be a very, depressing, gloomy, upsetting, very dire and possibly dry documentary about this horrible place. And I was kind of, steeling myself. And what I saw was something completely different, very, very warm, very affectionate, very conversational. I think that was my biggest takeaway of the tone and the style of the film. But beyond that, for me, this film, not being an expert, obviously, in the Iranian diaspora or the political history of it all, which I found fascinating, nonetheless. But for me, this film really was about trauma, but not just trauma, but the problem of communicating trauma. And this kind of problematic idea that if trauma isn't communicated, for instance, among generations, that it will just stop existing, or it will fade away to nothing, which is on the face of it kind of an absurd idea. But I can see the impulse to try to make that happen for somebody who's experienced such trauma. But I think it's clear that Maryam's film shows that this isn't what happens with trauma, and that trauma is actually communicated quite effectively, unconsciously, as well as intentionally, including in this intergenerational fashion. And we see this explicitly when Maryam is talking to Nina in London, and they both kind of recount these dreams or attacks they've had, and they don't know what's happening. And it's like, oh, well, this is actually things that happened to you in your past that you've forgotten or unconsciously suppressed, that are coming back to affect your life. And these are specifically their own buried memories, obviously, but I think there's something real to the idea that their parents can communicate their own traumas to their children through such kind of unconscious nonverbal cues. And specifically, I think it's very pointed that Maryam's stepfather is a psychologist who works specifically with these ideas with Holocaust survivors. I looked up his research a little online, and it says that he focuses on transgenerational transmission of extreme trauma, which stresses nonverbal unconscious communication. So that's exactly what we're talking about here. And one of the things on that note that stood out for me about the film was, and stood out for Maryam as well, in the film, was that so many of these, the women who she speaks to, either the former political prisoners or their children, have become psychologists and psychotherapists or therapists. And I thought, wow, that's really curious and interesting. And further speaking to that, I wonder how does Maryam reconcile the fact that her mother, Narges, is a very successful psychologist, but says that perhaps, in the denouement of the film, that there isn't enough space emotionally or mentally, headspace for her to reflect or embrace the good, meaning her new life in Germany, with the bad, or her past trauma, when she's quite possibly dedicated her professional life to helping people acknowledge and heal from these kinds of past traumas. So there's a kind of a strange personal hypocrisy going on there, with, why did she refuse to confront her own trauma? And more pointedly, even, why is she so hesitant to deny Maryam's right to know her own history and to be able to understand her own trauma? And I think, this is addressed in the film as well. It has a lot to do with the idea of individual versus collective trauma. And obviously this kind of trauma is not singular to Narges and even Maryam. This is something that, as Maryam is told, it's not your history, it's our history. But that tends to neglect the idea that Maryam's history is part of that history. Her your is part of the our. So how do we reconcile these two things as well? And I noticed that a lot of the women, particularly of the older generation that Maryam speaks to, appear to be kind of fairly defensive. Whereas Maryam seems to desperately seek conversation and connection, and including with the audience, as both of you have previously mentioned. I mean, especially through the voiceover, I find that she seems to anticipate what we're thinking, and sort of uses us as a kind of confidant throughout the film along her journey. And this makes sense to me because if you look at the psychologist versus actor and filmmaker, where Maryam is an actor and filmmaker, she makes her living attempting to create an emotional connection with an audience. And as a psychologist, Narges is reflecting on the emotional and psychological states of others. So she's not having to deal with her own trauma. She can deal with other people's trauma, as her former cellmate, I forget her name, said, when the trauma is about someone else, it's much easier to talk about. And we can all identify that. That makes perfect sense. Also what struck me as well is that almost all of Maryam's interview subjects, be they the survivors or their children, are women. And I can't help wonder if their reactions and suppressions of their own trauma might be the result of the fact that we as women are largely taught to ignore and suppress our own pain in service of the emotional needs of others. But that again becomes problematic because I can't quite square Narges's lack of response to her daughter's requests to talk about their time in prison, because this would be addressing and seeing to the emotional needs of her daughter. But perhaps she thinks she still knows what's best for her daughter, being her mother. But ultimately, I think the film conveys the importance of the idea of conscious and productive communication of and reflection on trauma. I do tend to wonder if its depiction of the wildly successful people in the film, generally speaking, they all have become extremely successful, tends to undercut that idea a little, because a lot of these people have seemed to, repress and suppress, do not want to talk about the past. That's something to consider. But I also wonder about the people who she didn't talk to, who she wasn't able to reach, who, like the woman who dropped out of the conversation, appearing on camera at the last minute. I'm wondering about what their experiences are like. Could they be a little darker, and that's why they haven't been able to reach out and share them? Obviously, Maryam and her mother's story is very, very dark and very traumatic and very upsetting to hear. But somehow I get the sense that the film is barely scratching the surface in terms of this trauma and really, really getting into the root of what's going on, and sort of putting not a happy face, but a kind of stiff upper lip quality to like the cellmate digging in the root vegetables, and just, you know, everything's wonderful. It's a nice day. We're moving ahead, you know, positivity and optimism, and how helpful in the long run that kind of response to these kinds of life-altering events is, and how it will continue to have sort of a domino effect throughout the generations. So on that note, I wanted to open up the discussion to the two of you, and I'm wondering how you feel about this concept of trauma and inherited trauma, the unconscious communication of these traumas, and do you think this kind of thing has a specific resonance with the Iranian diaspora and even the cinema of the Iranian diaspora, whether due to cultural or political reasons, or what do you think might make its response unique to that kind of community or community in exile?
Can I go first? Something that I hope that what I'm going to say will kind of respond or start what you just put forward, but there was something that both you and Alena talked about that I would like to kind of mention that, and that's something that I find, the way I looked at it, that the older generation, the mother or the cellmate of the mother, who were telling her that, you call it that maybe the mother knows better, that's why she doesn't want to share it with her. I looked at it as this, that is very commonly done, I think, in a lot of kind of Eastern cultures, that I don't know, the simplest example is that you have someone that you know they're terminally ill, but even the doctor allows you to not tell them in the Eastern culture, to kind of allow them, if they have another 6 months of their life, they happily live with that. While I find it in the Western culture, it is something that it's their right to know. So they need to know about this. So I find that there's a clash, and an interesting kind of intergenerational element that this film is showing, that she's a kid, she's a person who grew up in Germany, and she believes this is her right to know how she came to this world. While from her mother's perspective, that she went through a lot of this trauma, she managed to turn her life around and become a very successful woman. She wants her child to see and carry that forward. So I didn't see it as she's denying it. She was saving her. She was keeping her safe. So this kind of goes with what Alena was saying, that she was calling it post-diaspora rather than diaspora. And I find it, again, that's quite an interesting thing, because although by she's 30 some years old and she wasn't born in Germany, but she almost acts like a first generation diaspora, which they're a bit disconnected with what you would call the Iranian diaspora, who are kind of linking back to the Iranian identity, whatever that Iranian identity is that they're defining it, which is different, I find, in European Iranian diaspora versus North American ones. And in that case, she feels that disconnect. So she's not in search of that identity that is somehow linguistic, somehow going back, although there is that scene with the mother and reciting Hafiz, that it's something that goes back to what we think the Iranian kind of identity is, but that's not her question. She knows who she is as a person. What she cares about, that she wants to have the right to know exactly what happened to her. And I think that's, to me, was the interesting clash of cultures, and clash of someone who was, well, the mother who was born somewhere else, that probably I relate to her a bit more as someone who grew up in Iran, versus someone who grew up in Germany in a very kind of a very intellectual, educated, well-off in a way as well. So one little criticism that I think I would have from the film, which I think you kind of pointed it out, Michelle, as well, is that the film is showing all these very successful Iranian people who've managed to turn their lives around. I'm not saying that Iranian diaspora are not successful. I'm not saying that people are not trying to suppress all the traumas that they've gone through, but you almost felt that we're just looking at the rosy side of everything. And we don't really see people who cannot, like, I mean, I really like that scene with the rain, and then we knew that there was the only male person the only son that was born, or actually lived with his mom in EVIN, that he would come to the conference, but he would just walk around. He was the only male figure that we got a chance, and it was a beautifully shot because it was raining, and the distance of the camera almost made us stand where that guy is turning around. So that was the only glimpse.
Ghostly figure, almost like a shadow hanging over the film. Yeah,
exactly. So that was one glimpse of that kind of dark side of things. Even the scene with the father going through and bringing the towel, the long thing, even that scene wasn't traumatic enough for me. And it was just like, how did you make that to be positive? Like, and they're going through, you know, people executed and images. And that's one of the things that I had about the film, although I'm happy that, you know, by the end of it, you don't feel as torn that you would expect to be.
right.
Yeah, these are, I don't know if I answered or started.
Oh, yeah. And
Yeah.
and I'm glad you brought up the father as well, because I don't really feel like we get a good sense of what he's been. We know he's in Germany, I believe. So, but we don't know what happened to him post his release and after coming to Germany. And it seems to me like maybe he's not doing quite as well as Maryam's father or mother, I should say. And he's just not explored for some reason. And I found that there were a lot of that was one glaring gap in the story. And I know it's about her journey, but obviously he's integral to that. So I think that it would have been nice to have more of a sense of what was going on there as well. What do you think, Alena?
Yeah, the question of trauma is really interesting because I would say the big trauma or the trauma of the Iranian diaspora is 1979. It's the Islamic Revolution. So, and the Islamic Revolution in terms of well, the war that happened afterwards, but also for all those people for whom this revolution was not bringing the democracy or the freedom or the whatever, also maybe Western kind of new state that they wanted to. And I see it in a lot of, or I saw it in a lot of films of the Iranian diaspora, that is the main topic, actually, especially for films in the 80s and in the 90s, where this kind of, you know, dealing with this, yeah, this not only the trauma of the migration and the exile, but also of this kind of failed revolution is actually being much more a topic than in later movies from the 2000s or even now from, you know, the 2020s. And what is really interesting in Born in EVIN is that she makes this, let's say, collective trauma of the Iranian diaspora actually, she's not really talking about it. She's not really connecting to this overall narrative of, you know, what you might see in or have seen in other movies. She's making it a very personal story, and a very personal story, again, as also Maryam now pointed out, again, not about her Iranianness and not about her, you know, it's actually not really political what she's making, even though she is in all this kind of, you know, in Den Haag, in this trial, and in all this kind of very political conferences, if you want. But she's actually not really, I mean, I don't know if she's not interested, but the film is not interested in this kind of, you know, political stance towards the past. But it's very, very personal and very emotional. And in this sense, it is maybe, that would be a way to read it. It's very analytical. It's very maybe psychoanalytical how she is, you know, dealing with her own question, and also how the film is actually made in this, you know, way of this quest and of this being performative in a way.
Well, she mentions that she was in psychoanalysis for many years, right?
Yeah, true. That, yeah, so might be. I think we had.
Do we have questions? Well,
I know.
Yeah, I guess, you know, I had a question about whether or not the two of you thought that the film accurately depicts the variety of experience of the post-revolution Iranian diaspora. But I think you both sort of addressed that. Maryam, I wanted to ask you, I know that your work deals with gender a lot in Iranian cinema, and I'm wondering if you see this film in particular fitting in, or how you see it fitting in with other work of cinema by the diaspora, specifically of
I think probably Alena would be better, but just carrying it from what she just commented, which is very true, that a lot of the Iranian diasporic films of 80s and 90s are people with conscious memories of pre-revolution to post-revolution. So those are the people who fled the country because of the revolution. And there is a huge difference from that to this film, which again kind of goes with the fact that I think her connection with what classically would be the Iranian identity is not about that. It's about her family's identity, the way she wants to be identified in relation to her aunts and uncle, and the mother and father. And also something that I found it quite fascinating for me is that she does speak enough Persian, but clearly she's fluent 3 other languages. And this is something that you see her command in French, obviously German and English, and then her Persian isn't. So it is already very clear that her tie with the Iranianness is a lot weaker in that sense. And that kind of makes her, that's why to me, very quickly after 15 minutes of the film, felt like she's a really good example, and the film is a really good example of a European second generation immigrant experience that has made it. But I wanted more about that, but she didn't come back to that. The way that introduction sets it forward about the different roles, and I did not know that how famous she is. So thank you, Elena, for I didn't know. So in that sense, it's quite fascinating that again, it is a different kind of identity she's constructing. She wanted me as someone who didn't know to kind of see her as another kind of symbolic kind of actress that does certain roles, with those whole scenes of putting different hijabs on. Which is accurately, as you say, it's quite a performative element of the documentary as well, because she wants us to get certain elements. And
it's funny, actually. It's a very funny scene.
Yeah, totally. And it goes well with the parachute as well. So that
I was a bit confused by the parachute, though. Were either one of you confused by the parachute? I mean, it just sort of, she drops in there and then parachute in the beginning and the end of the film, and there's no other reference to, I mean, I'm taking it to be some kind of metaphor about maybe she takes the parachute off and she's gotten rid of the shackles of the past, but I was a bit confused by that.
Okay, so for me, I saw it because she's never been to Iran as well. So to me, it was like, she's kept this desert, arid land representing Iran.
Yeah.
Which, sorry to say that, to me, that was okay. That's a very kind of Western look of what Iran looks like. Which again, she's a kid who grew up here. That's
just
her.
Remember Iran. Yeah.
Yeah. So to me, that was supposed to be her. A symbolic birth in Iran. With her jump with the parachute. I don't know, that's how I read it.
I thought maybe she was like parachuting into behind enemy lines to go, find answers. And
I saw it as birth. I thought that was a different kind of birth coming to the world. Okay.
That makes sense, yeah. It doesn't look like we have any questions yet. Please do feel free, anyone, if you have a question. You don't need to speak on camera if you don't want. You can have me read out the question for you. Otherwise, I was wondering, Alena, I wanted to know more about our guest because I found her to be a very fascinating figure, like very formidable woman, clearly really impressive. But everything I found was in German, and I don't read German. So I'm wondering if you know like how well known she is in Germany. I know apparently her daughter is quite well known, as you said, and I think she was in the latest Christian Petzold film, right?
Yeah,
Undine?
exactly. Maryam Ghorbankarimi played in a series which was pretty famous. It was called 4 Blocks. There she played, actually, it was about Lebanese drug clans in Berlin. There she still kind of was casted in a more ethnic way because she played this kind of Lebanese wife of one of the Lebanese guys. But she played in the latest Petzold in Undine, where she plays a German woman. And it's not at all a question about ethnicity or anything. And she actually also played a German woman in a System Crasher from Nora Finkscheid, which was actually nominated for the Oscars entry this year. So in that sense, she is a, let's say, star in terms of a big deal, especially for the art house scene. And it's really interesting because, I mean, in a way, there is this shift, I think, in the art house scene in general to try to cast people, you know, not by this kind of ethnic thing. But it's interesting that she actually managed already to be casted in different roles. And this is why I found this first scene with the hijab, it's such a funny scene also. But her mother actually, she is, I mean, famous. She is pretty known in the Frankfurt area because she candidated as, like, she was a candidate for the mayor's position. So a few years ago, she was pretty, let's say, locally known. And also, I mean, it's actually a parallel because also, I mean, in Germany still we lack some diversity in many places, but especially in people who, like in politicians, right? So having an Iranian mayor of Frankfurt would have been a big deal, which did not happen. But I think in that sense, and as a psychotherapist, I don't know actually how famous she is. I assume that she's having enough clients for her, like, you know. But I mean, her, let's say, her being more visible was as a candidate
Right.
of the
But
Frankfurt.
she's not in politics any longer. I take it.
No,
Yep.
she's not.
Yeah. Okay. Well, unfortunately, we have just about 3 minutes left, and we don't have any questions. So I guess that's for the best because we don't have any time to answer them. And I feel like we could talk another hour about this film. It's really fascinating. There's so many layers to unpack here. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have. So I am just going to join Michelle, Aaron, and everyone at Screening Rights Film Festival. And thank you so much, Maryam and Alena, for joining us here today. It was really fascinating. I really, really appreciate your input, and best of luck.
Thank you very much again for the invitation. And yeah, then I hope to see you again digitally or in person.
Yes,
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
It was lovely meeting you all.
Sorry?
Lovely meeting you all
You
via
as
Zoom.
well. You as well. Did you want to say anything, Michelle? Or
only thank you all from the festival, and from myself and from Anya. And the film that we have coming up next, which is why this one needs to finish so promptly, is very interesting in terms of trauma again, and intergenerational trauma. So you might, those of you who aren't already coming to it, I would strongly recommend it as a continuation of some of these issues, but in a very different context of Palestine. So thank you all again, and I'm going to close the meeting now. So thank you and good night.
thank you.
Bye-bye.